Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Apologies for the technical issues, good old Zoom and Wi-Fi. Hopefully you'll be able to see me and see my photo, even though the video is frozen. So before we get started, I officially would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land in which I reside, and pay my respects to the elders, both past and present. Sovereignty was never ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So the days and times of our webinars at the Australia Institute always vary. So please visit our website at australiainstitute.org.au for all details of upcoming webinars. So hello and welcome. And apologies again for the slow start. We thank you so much for your patience. I'm Nina Gbor, the Director of the Circular Economy and Waste Program at the Australia Institute. So we're so excited to have on our webinar today, Planet Ark's Dr. Nicole Garofano on the circular economy and decarbonization.
Thank
Now,
you, Nina.
you're absolutely welcome. So just a few guidelines for our webinar to make sure it all goes splendidly. If you hover over the bottom of the screen, you should be able to see the Q&A function where you can ask questions to Nicole and also upvote questions and make comments. My colleague Vivian is moderating the questions. We'll do our best to answer as many of them as possible, but we won't be able to get through to all the questions today, unfortunately, because we only have just about an hour. So we ask that you please keep things civil in the comments. Please keep it short and keep it sweet. Otherwise, unfortunately, we might have to boot you from this webinar, and we hate doing that because we absolutely love our community. So we'll finish this webinar sort of around 12 p.m. This discussion is being recorded and will be posted on our website and YouTube channel. Now, before we start talking to Nicole, I'm just going to speak about this topic just a little bit. So circular economy and decarbonization, while the circular economy is about principles that design materials, so there's no waste, it focuses on eliminating waste and pollution, keeping products and materials in circulation at their highest value, and finally, regenerating nature. So decarbonization, on the other hand, looks at all the measures to reduce carbon footprint by minimizing or removing the output of greenhouse gas emissions, CO2, and methane into the atmosphere. Now, when you combine these two principles, decarbonization, the reduction of carbon emissions, and the circular economy, the reuse and regeneration of materials by design, you get two powerful concepts that, when put together, create a potent force to combat climate change and drive sustainable development. Now, why is this crucial? Because a circular economy can cut greenhouse gas emissions. How? By adopting the three principles of the circular economy in the products, services, and systems we design, we can also start to tackle the remaining 45% of emissions associated with industry, agriculture, and land use. So by eliminating waste and pollution, for example, we reduce greenhouse gas emissions across the value chain. By circulating products and materials, we retain their embodied energy. By regenerating nature, we sequester carbon in soil and products. Now, in buildings and construction, for example, by eliminating waste, sharing buildings more often by reusing recycling construction materials, we can reduce the emissions from construction materials, possibly by up to 38% by the year 2050. Now, Australia's built environment is driven by population and economic growth and climate change. The increasing need for space in buildings is actually increasing traffic congestion and consumption, which affects livability, environmental efficiency of the built environment. And this puts a lot of pressure on the sector. So our guest today, Dr. Nicole Garofano, will discuss circular design of the built environment that can reduce some of these pressures as well as reduce emissions. Nicole will also discuss how other sectors and products can also improve their practices to achieve net zero. We'll look at Planet Ark and what they have planned on their agenda to support Australians, businesses, organizations, communities in their circularity efforts this year. Nicole, thank you again for being with us today, and we apologize for the technical issues.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me, Nina. I think you've absolutely just nailed everything that we're talking about today. I feel like I
Thank
will,
you
I
so
will add
much.
a few, pepper in a few examples, but exactly what you said is the topic of the day. So I'm excited to be here.
That's fantastic. So, why don't you start off by telling us about Planet Ark, what you've achieved, and what your purpose is?
So many people may be familiar with Planet Ark. Planet Ark was founded in 1992, and it was at a time when curbside recycling was kind of limited, and there was only one person who was known as an environmental manager in the way that we use this term today. So it was a very different time and space, but society did see a need to want to do more for the environment. It was also at the time where the Rio Summit was happening. Agenda 21 was being released. So it was very much bringing to the fore this conversation around we need to protect our environment. But since that time, Planet Ark has become one of Australia's leading environmental behaviour change organisations. And we've really been focusing on providing opportunities for positive environmental action. Uh, Businesses in the audience may be familiar with Business Recycling, which is an online database, particularly for small to medium businesses looking for solutions for recycling options. And of course, none of our work happens without support. And in that particular instance, the New South Wales EPA provides financial support for business recycling. But we also have Recycling Near You, which is a much broader, anyone. It's actually offered by postcode. So one can enter their postcode and enter the product that one is looking to distribute on. And they can find solutions in their local area. So Recycling Near You is a valuable tool. But what I lead is the Australian Circular Economy Hub, which is another of Planet Ark's programs. We've got about 8, I think, in total. The Australian Circular Economy Hub, or the ACE Hub, we have a small dedicated team to really delivering Australia's national reference platform for circular economy knowledge and collaboration. And we collaborate across organisations with the ACE Hub, public, private, not-for-profit, academia, research. We have a range of services. The ACE Hub portal is one that everybody can join. It's kind of like LinkedIn, but for circular economy. Got 2,000 plus members, and Chelsea McLean, our community coordinator, does a fantastic job of engaging folks there. We have working groups, metrics and procurement. We have a wonderful advisory board, all of whom contribute volunteer time. And of course, we are super honoured to be working with organisations such as the Australia Institute to really accelerate the interest, the knowledge, and also the practice towards a more circular economy in Australia. So thanks for having us.
No, you're absolutely welcome. Thank you again for joining us. We are very excited by the work that you do and how you uplift the community with circular ideas and activities and
Yeah.
encourage neighborhoods and schools and other organizations in engaging in circularity efforts.
And
So
I think the important thing to note is when we reflect, Planet Ark's actually been working in the circular economy space for the whole of its 32 years. You know,
mhm.
the third principle, regenerating natural systems, we connect with that through National Tree Day and our seedling bank program. So in fact, we probably didn't call it circular economy back then, but over time, we realized that we've actually been supporting initiatives in a circular economy throughout the life of Planet Ark. So it's fantastic to see.
Yeah, it's quite impressive. You're ahead of your time. The circular
Yeah.
economy is a relatively newer principle compared to the sustainability discourse. Um,
Yes.
so it's pretty phenomenal that you were looking at regeneration before it became
Yeah.
the big conversation that it is today.
Yeah.
So in spaces of climate and decarbonization and circular economy, why is language or using the right wording such a critical factor? Because you and I have had this conversation before, and you've really emphasized the right words. And I've always wondered why that's so important.
I don't know. It could be, I'm a bit of a stickler for getting a good definition in because at the end of the day, language is critically important. If we're all working off of different definitions and different perspectives, which of course everybody has, but there does need to be harmonization and consistency in the way we approach things.
Yeah.
We're living in a finite cyclical system. with finite resources, we've actually put the system out of balance because of, a range of different issues.
Mm-hmm.
We're extracting materials at an unsustainable rate, more than 100 billion tonnes a year globally. And so we need to make sure that as we move forward, we don't have long. This is an urgent topic. We need to be able to agree on what is the language that we're using. And particularly when it comes to the climate decarbonisation discussion, I'll put those two together, and circular economy, people often see circular economy, particularly those working in business, circular economy as, this is another thing we've got to go and measure now. It's another thing to measure as part of our ESG. But what people miss, and it's something that you said in your opening, is that circular economy business models are actually tools to achieve decarbonisation outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think just having that understanding, and when you're looking at daily practice and how does that engage with circular business models, I think that is the piece around consistency. And we see this in a number of different areas. We tend to align with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation principles, which you introduced earlier.
Mm-hmm.
My favourite focus area is on design, because we know that if we don't design things from the very start, 80% of an environmental impact of a product could be a building, a car, piece of textile, a whole range of different products. But 80% of the environmental impact is determined in the design stage. So if we don't agree what is good design and the language on good design that can adopt circular principles, then we're not actually going to be able to achieve the decarbonisation outcomes that everyone is so busy working towards.
Right. Okay. I love that because I've come across many businesses and organizations that just want to throw their hands up when they hear circular economy because it just feels like another thing. And this is part of the reason why we're having this conversation today, to show that it works hand in hand, not separately.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. And as you also mentioned earlier about the 55-20, 55-45, there was a study done by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation that provided us with those numbers.
Yeah.
And we can do relatively easily that we can address 55% of global emissions by the way we use our energy, consume our energy for buildings and transport. So if tomorrow we all switched over to renewables, which of course won't happen tomorrow, but if we all switched over, 55% of emissions, done. We've got that sorted. But it's this 45% piece where the emissions are sitting in complex value chains and complex systems around that are embedded in the way we use our land, the way we produce our goods. So it's really, that is where the gold can be found in terms of not only just looking at your value chain or your supply chain, because now you've been told you've got to do something with scope 3 emissions. Actually, at the same time, let's look at how we can do this differently. Are there circular business models that can be adopted to engage our stakeholders and our suppliers differently to achieve decarbonisation outcomes? So the language, in summary, the language is critical in order for us to agree on our North Star, our future, decarbonised future, and the ways in which we can get there. So,
yeah, that makes sense. So what are a few specific sectors and products that use circular business models to reach their decarbonization outcomes, and how do they hit those targets?
Yeah, the circular business models are another one that's, there are different words, language, descriptors for circular business models, but there is one set of 5 that tend to be sort of an easy go-to. And these are used by Accenture, the OECD, and a range of other organisations. And these include circular supplies, which is essentially renewable, recoverable sources of materials that can be used as inputs to new products. Product as a service, and I'll come back to that shortly. Product life extension, fairly self-explanatory. Sharing platforms, and resource recovery. And so resource recovery is where recycling fits. And just a little quick point on the language thing as well. If all we think of with circular economy is recycling, we're actually missing out on a really, grand set of opportunities that we can do a lot better with what we're designing from the very get-go. So some examples, I think any industry actually can adopt these business models. It's just depending on how you examine your your value chain. You know, three that come to mind for us are built environment, as you mentioned, but we've also got textiles. And textiles can be everything from sheets and towels and surgical gowns to clothing. I know one of your passions in life is around clothing and fashion. You know, how do we get smart around doing that as well? Packaging. My PhD is in packaging. There are lots of opportunities to reduce emissions. And one quick thing that I think is interesting, and we'll come to some built environment examples shortly, but people often think about the sort of quite external emission generators. You know, one that comes to mind is flight, aviation transport. You know, the emissions from aviation transport is about 3%. Now you think, oh, well, I've got to cut down on my flights because, you know, which we do. We need to be conscious of where we're flying and also what class of travel we're flying in. But guess what? The emissions from organics going to landfill is also about 3%. So we can actually make some really significant shifts in the way that we engage with food, either as a food service organisation, a business, or even our food at home. There is actually more greenhouse gas emissions in the production of food than what there is in the packaging alone, for example. So if we're wasting products, then we're actually not only wasting the physical inputs, the water, the land use, etc., but we're also wasting the invested carbon that has gone into to creation of those products.
Precisely.
So I think that applies to anything. And I think it really comes down to this message of it's about being efficient. So in all the sectors that I just mentioned and many others, automotive as well is another big one. It's about being efficient with not just the materials that we consume, but efficient with the carbon that is contained and embodied or embedded in those products that we're using. So how can we get better use out of them in the first instance, or maybe we don't need them at all? You know, do we need to produce those products in the first instance? Can we use pre-loved? And then how can we make sure that the longevity of that investment in those emissions is actually extended and you know, be used more efficiently across the life cycle?
Sure. So looking at the built environment in other countries, what exemplary models have you found that we can use in Australia for net zero results? And in addition to that, I was also wondering, you know, why you chose the built environment as a focus sector this year. Is it because it's one of the biggest or most unregulated sectors when it comes to waste?
I think what we found, so if we cast our minds back a couple of years, we had the privilege and the pleasure of working with the diplomatic missions of the Netherlands and RMIT University to host Professor Jacqueline Kramer, who is a global expert on circular economy from the Netherlands. She's been a minister of government. She's worked with industry. She's also an academic. And she really highlighted to us where significant change can be made from a volumetric material consumption standpoint. And when you look at the built environment and you consider what goes into creating products in the built environment, it's very resource intensive. You know, a comparison, for example, if we look at timber construction versus using concrete in buildings, you know, one that often is cited in Australia is 25 King Street, which is the Lend-Lease and Oricon building in Brisbane. Designing this particular building as a mass timber construction, sustainably sourced mass timber, important. It's really looking at the comparison between timber and concrete. The studies that were shown in the design of this building was that the building could reduce carbon over the 60-year life of the product of the building by about 74% versus a traditional reinforced concrete design. So it's interesting when you look at what are the materials we're using and how can those materials be used more efficiently when there are so many materials being used in the built environment. So it's really about volume. And by the way, you know, the investments that go into the built environment were two big reasons as to why we chose that sector. And by no means we're not experts, and I'll you know, put my hand on my heart. and say, I'm not an expert in the built environment. There are many great organisations doing exceedingly inspiring work. GBCA, Property Council of Australia, Infrastructure Sustainability Council. We're here to support and act as sort of a supporting mechanism. How can we engage and provide perhaps a different perspective to those organisations who are doing good work in this space? And we saw a lot of great examples in Europe. Last year, we had the privilege of hosting a study tour, which was centered around the World Circular Economy Forum, which was held in Helsinki. But we were able to include a full week, a very busy, dedicated week of meetings and site visits across the Netherlands. And we also went, Paul Klemenko, our Chief Sustainability Advisor and co-founder, we also went to Sweden. And some great examples there around design for disassembly. So this is where buildings are purposely designed, literally to be unbolted at end of life, so that they can be reused in that same structure, but in another location, perhaps with some modifications. But one example was from Utrecht, which was a building called the Greenhouse. And in this case, what happened was the local municipality designed an area, had a master plan for an area, but there was one space that they didn't have a plan for it for the next 10 to 15 years. It had a long-term plan, but in the meantime, they said, let's see if we can get something utilizing this space. So they had a competition to come up with ideas of designing a building that could be disassembled within 10 to 12 years and literally moved to another location within the city. And now what they have is a fantastically beautiful building. As I say, it's called the Greenhouse in Utrecht. You can Google it. It's a wonderful space. It's got glass, it has steel, it can all be disassembled. It's a cafe, it's meeting rooms. It's a really lovely space. How does this link to decarbonisation? They've invested the carbon in the materials in that design that can be unbolted and reused in their current state at their highest value in another location. So reducing virgin materials also reduces virgin emissions. Another example that crosses over between transport, public transport, electric vehicles and housing is from the city of Gothenburg, which is in Sweden. There happens to be that Volvo buses are located as their head office in Gothenburg. But the city was looking to electrify their bus fleet. And so with this, they partnered with Volvo and a number of other stakeholders, did a small pilot. But now what they've done is converting their bus fleet, about 75% of their fleet, 500 odd buses, to electrification. Now, that's great. There's so many benefits to that for public transport. But the batteries in buses don't last as long as in vehicles. They might last 3 to 5 years. And so what they said was, well, let's think about what we can do with those batteries at the end of that life, because they might not work for buses, but they can work in a stationary capacity. So they partnered with a housing project that was being designed in Gothenburg to reuse the batteries out of the buses in a stationary housing project that was a sustainably designed housing project to get another 10 years out of those batteries. And then at end of life, another company, Northvolt Batteries, which is another Swedish company, is building capacity to recycle those lithium batteries to bring it back around again. So, it's really about where are the virgin emissions being created and how can they be extended throughout the life of their product. There were many others. The bridge bank, when bridges are being considered for improvements or replacement, the bridge goes into like a Facebook marketplace, which is a government-run bridge bank. And other municipalities can look at those bridges and say, well, this might fit our area. It holds its structural integrity. Let's reuse it in its current form, again, perhaps with a few modifications. So many great examples coming out of Europe. They've got lots of policy. There's a global alliance on buildings and construction, which is doing great work to head towards a near zero emission and resilient building strategy by 2030. And there's just so much that can be achieved by, looking at what's already in situ and doing building reuse, adaptive reuse, and looking, as a really smart climate policy.
Well, that's really inspiring because it just shows what's possible if organizations, businesses, governments are incentivized, you know, who actually choose to want to have these circular models.
Yeah.
And that leads actually into the next question I wanted to ask, which is around policies, because you mentioned a lot of policies coming out of Europe. And so, what policies and infrastructure do we need here in Australia that should be implemented to ensure the built environment is always designed for some of these operations that you described, you know, the modularity, the adaptability, the disassembling instead of the conventional demolition and ending up in landfill?
Yeah, look, I think that we've got some great examples to go by, and there is a lot of work going into this space. Again, GBCA Property Council, Infrastructure Australia are doing some wonderful work on putting forward suggestions, but we also have a circular economy ministerial advisory group in Australia. This group is made up of 15 experts across different fields. They've been meeting since February last year, and they've just released an interim report. So if you haven't seen that, it's well worth a read. But what we see from that is that there are recommendations connecting circular approaches, again, to this overarching net zero decarbonisation strategy. We see that, you know, the suggestions from Europe are really around putting the language of disassembly, reusability, repairability into policy that is, for example, the Eco Design Sustainable Products Regulation has just been approved about 6 or 7 weeks ago in the European Parliament. This will come into play for products that might be supporting the built environment, not necessarily for buildings and construction. There is another set of policy for that. But what we see is a range of suggestions around how to do this. A big driver is procurement. And so we've seen a couple of weeks ago, our friends at the Department of Environment released the environmentally sustainable procurement policy. So this is for all of Australian public service.
Yes.
So, and guess what? Construction is first cab off the rank. So 1st of July, any federal tender that's over $7.5 million needs to address the circularity principles, which are clearly laid out in that policy, including using less materials, designing for adaptability, using recycled content, considering products as a service. So when we look at the amount of investment in procurement across all 3 levels of government, which in this country is estimated by the OECD to be about $384 billion, there's significant shift both in spend and materials, and by the way, reducing carbon that can be achieved by changing a procurement policy. We've also got the South Australian government in their procurement for infrastructure. Their number is higher, $50 million and over. But with their policy, they're requiring organisational emission reductions for each of the contractors that were bidding for their work to really address their own, you know, scope 1, 2, 3 emissions. So procurement is a really big one. But we're also seeing that policies around, you know, prioritising refurbishment over demolition is one that can be considered, including benchmarks. Looking at how can we shift the Australian Building Code to incorporate some of these, because a lot of the decisions that are made, the National Construction Code, of course, is the overarching, you know, system.
Overarching body,
that enables the decisions that are made on a lot of construction. So how can we incorporate the supporting these products both in the design phase, and Infrastructure Australia is doing some work on that presently, to reduce end of life? Because when we start talking end of life and we start talking recycling, we've kind of missed the boat. We've missed the opportunity, and the ministerial advisory group under Minister Plibersek is very much on board with, you know, changing that language and really bringing that design conversation to the fore.
She is.
Yeah.
Sorry, we're gonna have to move to audience questions. We've been talking about this for ages, and I have so many more questions to ask you, but it's only fair that we allow the audience to get their questions.
Thank you.
So, well, thank you. You've made a lot very clear. So I'm just going to have a look at the
I'll let you decide.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you go ahead
That's
and
some
pick
great
something.
questions here.
Yeah, we've talked a lot, so you go ahead and pick something that you feel you'd like to discuss, you'd like to answer, if there is one. There's one here. Should we be focusing firstly on reducing, reusing, then recycling?
Yes, yeah. I mean, that's the simple thing that many of us have grown up with over the years. And reduce, reuse, recycle that's the order of the hierarchy.
Hmm.
Absolutely. And in recent years, that has been expanded. Again, Professor Kramer from the Netherlands shared with us her ladder of circularity, which starts with refusing. Um, and in the traditional waste hierarchy that the European Commission has been using for, since the 1980s, prevention was the first one on their list. So prevention, refusal, asking the questions, do we actually need this item, this good, building, car, textiles, packaging? If we need it, do we need to use something brand new? Can we look at something else? If we need to produce it, can we design it so that it is far more, it's designed for longevity, designed for durability, repairability.
Hmm.
So absolutely, David, that's spot on the money. That is exactly the order. Recycling is number 9 on that list of 10, by the way. So there are many other options that we can look to before we get to recycling. And we should be designing products with that in mind.
So speaking of the list of 10, there's a question here. What were those 5 business models again? This is a question for
Yes,
everyone.
good question. Yep. So the
So,
first one is circular supplies. And if you Google Accenture or the OECD and do circular business models, that should come up for you. But circular supplies is the first one. Product as a service is the next one. Product as a service is kind of like leasing, but what it does in the circular economy space that we now sit in is that the products that are actually designed to be used as a service are designed as such. So they're designed to be far more, what's the word? They're stronger. They can easily be repaired. They have more rigor in their design. And so what you find is that instead of having maybe a 12-month or a 3-year lease, actually the subscription or the lease can go for 5 or 10 years, because during that time, the product is very well maintained and it is designed to live that long. So product as a service is one that's coming to the fore in different models in our sort of modern interpretation of circular economy. So circular supplies, product as a service, product life extension, so designing for longer life, getting more value, sharing platforms. And so looking at, everything from vehicles to clothing to buildings, platforms that can enable sharing, and then resource recovery, which is where recycling tends to fit. So circular supplies, product as a service, product life extension, sharing platforms, resource recovery.
sure. Okay, and there's a question here about repair, saying repair is so expensive in Australia. What to do? What can we do to overcome it?
Repair is such an important component of a viable transition to a circular economy. And I had the absolute privilege of having some time with Professor Leanne Wiseman from Griffith University earlier this week, and we were talking about the right to repair. And of course, the Productivity Commission came out with a report a couple of years ago on the right to repair. And, we were discussing what's been able to be adopted. There has been, I think, only 1 or 2 of the recommendations that have been adopted to date, which is a shame. But there's the simple act of choosing to hold on to products for 12 months longer than what you might have done. So if you get a phone, do you need to have a new phone every year, or can you extend the life of that phone to have it for 2 years? Even just if we all did that, if everybody did that, then the amount of raw materials that we're extracting would be reduced significantly. But to the question, how do we encourage that when it's so expensive? There are policies, for example, around can we incorporate a tax deduction that is an attractive tax deduction for repairing products. So, say if a product might be $200 to buy new, there's a fault to it, it might cost you, I don't know, $120 to fix it, and you think, oh gosh, $120 to fix it. Why don't I just go and buy a new one? But if you can get $120 or even $100 back on a tax return because you've chosen to repair at a reputable repair organisation, that might shift how people start to see repair. So that's one solution. The other thing around repair is, looking at what is the warranty period of products. And Leanne was sharing with me that the question of warranty periods is perhaps too short. If the warranty period was longer and product manufacturers were required to support products for a longer period of time as a policy, then that might bring the repair conversation into a different light as well. So there's a few suggestions that Leanne and those that very much sit in that right to repair movement are working on very heavily.
Okay. You mentioned the recycling of lithium batteries in Europe. And there's a question here about what progress is being made here in Australia on battery recycling and reuse.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I think there's quite a bit of attention on batteries in Australia. Minister Ed Husic has taken to batteries as one of his focus areas for the Future Made in Australia program. There are a couple of battery recyclers in Australia, but the challenge is to what degree do we recycle the batteries here? Like, to what sort of granular level can we take those valuable resources and reprocess them here? We can't get down to there is limited capacity to be able to recycle in the full sense of the word in Australia, but not to say that we can't do it here. The example that I mentioned earlier around Northvolt, which is the Swedish-based company, they've proven that they can recycle a battery, including everything, the plastic that encompasses the battery itself, all the components. They've proven it can be done. So there's nothing to say that we can't do that here. The question is, what's the level of interest for investment in these types of technologies, and how do we build the scale to enable that here? And I think there's enough attention on it at the moment to have some good faith in what will come with that, let's say within the next sort of 5 to 10 years. But I would say that it's, although there are some companies doing it here, we could do a lot more.
We absolutely can. Perhaps, I don't know, heavy investment, long-term investment in infrastructure and education. So let's dial it right back and go right back to basics. There's a question here with a lot of votes asking the difference between the circular economy and environmentally sustainable economy from an application point of view.
So one thing that I learned, we have a procurement working group, and in order for myself to be a little bit, again, I'm not a procurement expert, but in order for myself to be a little bit more aware when I started this role, I dove into what's the difference between circular procurement and sustainable procurement, because to me they kind of sounded like the same thing. And it kind of relates to this question. So what we're seeing here is, through the research that I did, is, again, it comes back to the decarbonisation question. Circular procurement is a tool to address sustainable development. So sustainable development is the sort of North Star that everybody's working towards. We've got our SDGs, of which the circular economy contribute a lot. And so I guess it just comes back to what is the difference between circular economy and environmental sustainable economy? I guess the environmentally sustainable economy could be similar. I think if we're talking about what's a sustainable economy, what's sustainable development in the economy, the difference between that and circular economy, in the way that perhaps the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and others think about it, there tends to be more of a focus on material flows and how that works within the circular economy. Whereas sustainable development, of course, incorporates all, social, economic, and environmental. Now, if you've become familiar with donut economics, so this is Kate Rayworth's theories on circularity and encompassing in that circle. Kate Raworth's theory very much encompasses the benefits to social, the social benefits of circularity. And more recently, there's been the question of how do we create a just transition to circularity, and then by extension to achieve sustainable development. So again, in summary, comparing between circular economy and environmental sustainable economy, the environmental part of the sustainability, one feeds the other, one supports the other, but more broadly, we're all working towards sustainable development.
Okay, so sustainable development is the overarching goal, whereas the circular economy sits within that overarching goal.
Again, circular practices. So, simple things, taking it back to your comment, Nina, simple things. If you're trading products on Facebook Marketplace, keeping them in their current form, you're participating in the circular economy because you're reusing a product in its highest value. If you are using like a go-get car sharing service, you are participating in the circular economy because you're reusing and using a sharing platform model. So the simple actions that one can take on a daily basis, you're likely already participating in a circular economy that also supports reduction of environmental impacts.
Sure. So you mentioned transitioning in just ways, and I really like that because I am a fan of the aspect of degrowth that is about drastically scaling back material and resource use in the first place, and then practicing the circular principles and sustainability goals, which leads into this really interesting question from Shan that says, should we stop the UN double talk of sustainable development and talk about degrowth to reduce the plague of people on the planet to an eternally sustainable level in each bioregion of our nation as achieved by Indigenous Australians for over 65,000 years?
Great question, Shan. Look, I don't know if we stop the talk of sustainable development. I feel like we probably need to get a little bit more serious about how we can achieve the SDG goals, because personally, I think the SDGs are good as goals, and the tactics that sit within them, I think, are good. I think the question of degrowth is a scary one. It sort of incites, well, we have to stop all of what we're doing now, and some may say yes, but we are a very much more expanded population globally. I mean, we've got 8 billion people on the planet. There's the question around, is there too many people on the planet? That's a question that also comes into this discussion. I think what we have to realize is that the practices of Indigenous Australians, we absolutely need to tie in more to practices of Indigenous Australians and other Indigenous peoples across the planet. But the question is, how do we do this in a way that can provide us or connect us with our modern lifestyles, but paring back perhaps our modern lifestyles and really being a little bit more conscious about each decision that we make as individuals and as organizations about what we're doing, how we're using products, why we're using products in the way we are, and how can we do this in a way that not only reduces the impact on the planet, but also enables and encourages a society that is kind to one another and is a socially just society.
Sure.
I'm probably sounding like a going on to the we need world peace. Yes, but I think that it comes down to us as individuals in the first instance to question everything that we do from a sustainability perspective. If everyone did that, I don't know that we would have to do a degrowth discussion because we would all be living within our own limits.
Okay. So what do you think This is a question from Bernie. What do you think about Japan capturing CO2 for return to Australia to be combined with green hydrogen to make green methane? Is there any way at all that this makes sense? Should notions like this and hydrogen from brown coal be censored?
Wow, that's really fascinating, Bernie. I don't think I wouldn't say that I know much about any of those facts that you've raised there. I didn't know that Japan was talking about capturing CO2 to returning to Australia, green hydrogen to make green methane. Look, I'm not an expert at all on the conversation around hydrogen. It is an area that I'd like to learn a lot more of, particularly with the government's investment into hydrogen in the budget. What I do know, what I personally observed with hydrogen is there are specific uses for hydrogen. It's not going to be something that everybody uses. I remember having a conversation with somebody once about that hydrogen is useful for long range transport, for example. So with our distances in Australia, it might be something that we could consider there. But the question comes to how is the hydrogen being made? If we're having to use traditional fossil fuel based power in order to make the hydrogen, well, I guess you have to question why do we do that when we could go, easily just reduce the power use to create the hydrogen and instead go to electrification. But if we're using renewable energy to create the hydrogen, then that's a different discussion. But that's probably all I could say about that, Bernie. I'm sorry I don't have a full answer for you.
That's okay. The circular economy, I feel like, is still growing and developing and being
Yes,
formed in
absolutely.
many areas. So I think it's impossible, no matter how much of an expert you are, because it's still a relatively new sector, it's hard to have all the answers, particularly in every sector, every aspect of it. So
It is. Yeah. I mean, I do my best. I think in this role, I have lots of conversations of lots of different sectors. I feel very privileged to do that. But there's always going to be gaps. And I feel like, conversations like this, Bernie, I might have to go and do some research myself now and hear more about this capturing of CO2. I think that's part of this journey.
yeah,
Nobody knows everything. And I think
no,
anyone that does can claim that is kind of maybe they're missing some stuff. And I
yeah,
think part of the transition, a really important part of the transition is sharing the knowledge
sure.
and widely. And I think that's what the ACE Hub is here to do. I mean, that's my role, speaking to all of you today and many other platforms that I have the honor to contribute to. How can we do that better? And I think, hearing from all of you, join our portal is one way to get some of these other answers perhaps connected or answered, because knowledge is power, as we know, and it can be used in either way. So let's use it
Absolutely.
for the betterment of this transition.
Absolutely. Um, I think there's such great opportunity in that, in these questions, is looking for answers ourselves because sometimes we don't have an answer. Humanity has
Yes,
never been in a place where consumption has been at such peak levels, right? So we
absolutely.
don't have a precedent to go by. So when there's a question, I think if we're able, it's up to us to try and figure out solutions, whether it's looking for best practice in other countries
Yep.
or finding solutions right here that are homegrown, because there are a lot of solutions here in Australia. There are
Oh,
a lot of
loads.
organizations
Yeah.
that have created solutions. We just need to support them, fund them, nurture
Yep.
these industries. And I strongly believe that we can have strong circular systems here in Australia.
Yep.
Certainly easier to manage than other countries with perhaps bigger populations and more complex
Yep.
problems and
Yeah.
systems that have been around for much longer than we've been in
Yeah.
existence.
I think the reality is, people often say, will we ever get to 100% circularity? I don't know that we ever will. I think going
No.
back to the earlier question around Indigenous cultures and 65,000 years ago, the way that Indigenous peoples lived with the land, as part of country, as part of nature, is something that we can aspire to in ways that we can in our modern interpretation.
Sure.
But I don't think we could ever be 100% circular. There will always be
No,
products that will need to be like hazardous products, etc. That will need to be managed differently. But
sure.
we do a pretty darn good job of making decisions daily that we can move towards that. We just need to do it quicker. That's all.
Sure. Well, we're going to have to round up, Nicole. I just want to thank you so much for sharing your knowledge here with us today. Just very quickly, in less than a minute, can you talk about what planet, where people can go to learn more about Planet Ark and some of the activities and campaigns that you have for the rest of the year?
Yes, thank you. Awesome. So go to the website acehub.org.au. That's our knowledge hub, our website. We also have a portal, which is portal.acehub.org.au. And the portal has 2,000 plus members. So lots of people on there who are, either learning or have good knowledge on circularity. So get connected there. And we've got a couple of programs that we're going to be launching this year. So keep an eye out, get registered with the portal and our newsletter to keep up to date. There's more to say on that probably in the next month, 2 months' time. And we'll have a conference as well later at the end of this year. So we'll be releasing more information on that within the next 6 weeks or so as well. So lots to look forward to. And we're pretty excited and feel very privileged to be part of today's discussion and part of this ecosystem where we need to create the change.
Absolutely. So, a big thank you to everyone who has joined us today, and we very much appreciate your patience with all the technical issues. It is what it is. And so, our next webinar is Unparliamentary, and that's on Tuesday, May 28th, with veteran political journalist and columnist for the Saturday paper and the New Daily, Paul Bongiorno. The webinar will unpack the big political and policy issues. So visit our website, australiainstitute.org.au, to register. Okay, I think that's a wrap. Nicole, thank you so very much
Thank
for
you,
being
Nina.
with us today. It was such a pleasure to have you. And
Okay.
I think that's it. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank
Have
you.
a
And thanks everyone
wonderful,
for joining. Thanks for your questions. Have a
fantastic.
great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.